Maxwell Cameron. He's in Vancouver and is a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia's School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. Mr. Cameron, thank you very much for being with us here on TRT World. So, Trudeau gambled. He's won, but he is slightly diminished in his role as Prime Minister, correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. He rolled the dice hoping to win a majority government. He failed. He's still the prime minister, so in that sense, it's a victory. But I think it's a disappointment for the prime minister because the issue that's dogged him throughout this campaign has been, why did we have to hold this election? And when the results suggest, as they seem to be at this point, that we are going to have a parliament very much like the last one, I think a lot of Canadians are going to be asking why we had this election in the first place.
Well, it gives him another term in office, doesn't it? So, I mean, when will he potentially have to hold his next election? And this gives him, I guess, a mandate, even if it is a minority government, to lead for the next 4 or 5 years.
I think that's right. That's the claim that the prime minister can make is, I have a mandate because I've gone back to the voters after 17, 18 months of pandemic, and we've been returned with a minority, but nonetheless the plurality of the seats. Now, we do have in Canada a fixed election rule, but as you can see, it's honored in the breach. In principle, a minority parliament could last for several years, but as we've seen in this case, that doesn't always happen. And so I think we're going to see the prime minister attempt to rule probably without forming either a coalition or even a supplying confidence arrangement with the opposition, essentially expecting them to support him on confidence matters, on budgets, on a speech from the throne. But at some point, there will be another election, and it's anybody's guess as to when that might actually happen.
That's interesting. And what does this tell us then, Mr. Cameron, about Canadian politics and the Canadian political mood? Of course, we saw Erin O'Toole of the Conservatives moving that party slightly more to the centre in some ways, and also bringing in more social policies that were a surprise to many commentators, and yet he wasn't able to top Trudeau. So what does that tell us about the way that Canadians are feeling about their politics right now?
Well, I'd really say two things. One is that this is not a highly polarized country. There really is a convergence around the center-left on policies. Erin O'Toole, as you've just mentioned, did pivot toward the center. The Liberals ran on a fairly left-of-center campaign. The NDP is a party that appears to have picked up some seats, and they are the party on the left. The parties on the extremes have not done particularly well, although the Greens have survived to fight another day. So this isn't a highly polarized country. But the other point that I would make is that I think it's good for our democracy that we didn't get a majority. Canadians expect our parliamentarians to work together. The way that our electoral system is designed to function is that we choose parliamentarians and they form the government in parliament. It ought to be possible to make this parliament work, just as it was possible to make the last parliament work. So I think the larger lesson in terms of Canadian democracy is a really rather positive one.
I agree entirely. I'm glad you mentioned robust democracy, Maxwell, because, of course, this election, in contrast to what just happened in Russia and perhaps looking ahead to what happens in Germany at the weekend, does show how democracy can work and how political parties with different opinions can end up working together.
Yes, this is a time in which we can't take for granted democracy. We're seeing the rise of authoritarianism and radical extremism around the world. And while we did see some of that, and I think that the pandemic has stressed people, and we have seen a bit of extremism, demonstrations around hospitals against masks and vaccinations and so forth. So there is a kind of rancor in our politics, but it hasn't reached the levels that we see, for example, south of the border in the United States.
Absolutely right. OK, Maxwell Cameron, Professor of Political Science at British Columbia School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, thank you very much for being with us.